Welcome back to Empowerment with Dr. Lawrence. I am your host, Dr. Lawrence, and wherever you're consuming this, however you're consuming this, thanks for making me part of your day. Look, over the last several weeks, we've been building a framework that I believe explains why some people consistently perform at a higher level than others. Not because they're more talented or more intelligent, but because they've developed the capabilities required to sustain success. We started with identity capacity because performance always begins with who you believe you are. Then we discussed emotional capacity because your emotions influence your decisions, your reactions, and ultimately your performance. And last week, we explored cognitive capacity, the way you think, the way you solve problems, the way you process information, and the way you make decisions. Today, we're moving into what may be one of the most important capacities of them all, relational capacity. Here's why. No matter how gifted you are, no matter how much education you have, no matter how successful you become, your life will always be connected to other people. Success is rarely a solo accomplishment. Businesses require teams. Families require relationships. Organizations require trust. Leadership requires influence. Every meaningful accomplishment in every life eventually involves another human being. And that's where many people begin to struggle. Not because they're bad people, not because they don't care, not because they've reached limits of because they've reached limits of their relational capacity. So think about the people you've encountered throughout your life. Have you ever known someone who was incredibly intelligent, but almost impossible to work with? Maybe you've met someone you genuinely love. They genuinely love their family, but every conversation seemed to be in conflict. Perhaps you work with a leader with tremendous vision, okay? But nobody enjoyed working with them. We usually explain those situations by talking about personality. We say that these people are difficult, that they're stubborn, that they're controlling, they're introverted, maybe they're extroverted, I don't know. But what if it's not the real issue? What if we're looking at the symptom instead of the cause? What if the real issue is capacity? That's what I want to explore today, because I believe many of the relationship problems we experience are not simply personality problems, they're capacity problems. And here's something I've learned over the years. Every relationship has a capacity requirement. Think about that. Being married requires capacity. Being a parent definitely requires capacity. Being a friend, a good friend at that, requires capacity. Okay. Being a business partner requires capacity. Mentoring someone requires capacity. Your dependable employees, that requires a lot of relational capacity. So relationships makes demands on us, and they require patience. They require communication and trust and humility, forgiveness, and consistency. So the ability to navigate disagreement without destroying the relationship, capacity. The ability to listen when we'd rather speak, capacity. The ability to understand another person's perspective without immediately defending our own, capacity. Those aren't personality traits. Those are capacities. And when the demands of a relationship exceed your capacity, the relationship begins to suffer. That doesn't necessarily mean somebody's toxic. I know that's the buzzword of the day, but it doesn't mean you're toxic. Or does it mean that, this individual doesn't love you? Doesn't mean that they lack character. It may just simply mean they don't yet have the capacity required for this relationship. And that's an important distinction. Because if capacity can be developed, okay, then the relationships can improve. Now, I want to connect it to something we've discussed throughout this series. Remember, these 5 capacities don't operate independently. They work together. Identity capacity determines who you believe you are. Emotional capacity determines how you manage your feelings. Cognitive capacity determines how you process information and make the decisions you make every day. But here's the key. Relational capacity is where every other capacity becomes visible. Your relationships reveal your capacities, right? If your identity is unstable, people eventually experience insecurity. If your emotional capacity is low, people are going to interact with your reactions. If your cognitive capacity is compromised, people eventually experience poor decisions and misunderstandings. So relationships become the environment where your internal capacities are put on display for the world to see. That's why relationships are such an accurate measure of performance. Not because relationships have to be perfect, but because no more than, people being easy and all of that, right? Relationships expose what exists beneath the surface. So here's the question I want you to think about throughout today's episode. When people experience you, what do they consistently experience? Is it trust, uncertainty, encouragement, criticism, or do they, experience consistency or inconsistency, rather, unpredictability? Do they experience someone who helps them perform better, or do they have to recover after every interaction with you? Those are difficult questions, right? But if we're honest, okay, your relationships they're simply a reflection of your intentions. Okay. I like to say that your relationships are a reflection of your capacity. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to unpack today. Next, we're going to define relational capacity more precisely and examine the characteristics that distinguish high capacity relationships from those that consistently struggle. So now that we've defined relational capacity, I want to take the conversation a little deeper. Here's something I want you to think about. Relationships don't create your strengths. They don't create your weaknesses. They just reveal them. So think about it. You can believe you're patient until somebody tests your patience. You could believe you're a good communicator until you're misunderstood. You could believe you're humble until somebody disagrees with you. You can even believe that you're forgiven until somebody hurts your feelings. So relationships have a way of exposing what's really happening beneath the surface. And that's why I often say that relationships are testing. They're the testing ground. They're the proving ground of your capacity. Okay. So you may remember from our previous episodes that we've talked about identity, emotional, cognitive. These capacities exist inside of you, right? Relational capacity is different. It's where people around you begin to experience those capacities. If your identity is unstable, people experience insecurity. Remember, if your emotional capacity is low, people are dealing with your emotional reactions. If your cognitive capacity is compromised, they're going to be dealing with misunderstanding you. Okay, the assumptions about you and your poor decisions. So relationships don't invent those things. They just expose them. So this is what makes relationships uncomfortable. They just hold up a mirror. Sometimes we don't like what we see, but that's also what makes relationships one of life's greatest opportunities for growth. So I have a funny story. I have a teacup Yorkie named Freddie. Now, Freddie's my buddy, right? Good friends. It wasn't always like that. So when we first got Freddie, I was the one that trained him. Yeah, I yelled a lot. And before anybody calls the pet police, let me explain. I wasn't abusing Freddie. I was just trying to correct him. Okay, if he got into something he shouldn't, I raised my voice. If he wouldn't listen to me, I raised my voice. Okay, if he didn't come when I called, guess what I did? I raised my voice. In my mind, I was training him and I was training him good. But one day I noticed something that bothered me, right? Whenever people came to the house, Freddie would haul to the door, his little tail just wagging and, 100 miles an hour. He couldn't wait to see him sniff their feet and all of that. And then I come home from work and he peek around the corner and be like, oh, it's you. No tail wagging. And he like scoff at me, like cut his eyes. And I was like, oh, what is that? Here's the crazy part. I'm buying his food. I'm taking him outside so that this big old hawk in the neighborhood doesn't come and take him and make him lunch. And he didn't care. I wasn't the person he was excited to see. And it got my attention. So I started asking myself, why is this? Then it hit me. Freddie wasn't responding to my intentions. He was responding to my experience. He was experiencing me in a different way. So, I intended to train him. He just saw me as the dude that yelled. I was trying to protect him. He just saw me as this harsh, mean guy. And so that's it. It made me take a step back. And if I'm honest, look at myself under a different lens. And it was a hard realization because I had a choice. I could keep blaming the dog. I keep yelling at the dog, or I could look in the mirror, decide to change, stop yelling. I was still firm. Okay, let me keep it honest with you. But I wasn't loud anymore. I did something else. I changed the environment. Instead of taking Freddie in the backyard where I was always yelling at him, I started taking him to the front yard. I let him smell everything. I call him, I let him check his puppy emails. So every dog in the neighborhood that walks by, they leave messages and he goes out and leaves his messages. I mean, he's this big and he has a 12-gallon bladder, obviously, because he's hitting every blade of grass, right? But I did something else in that moment. I loved on him. Who's a good boy? Who's a good boy? Freddie, come here. Okay. And I know you're thinking, didn't this dude serve in the Army? I did. Combat veteran, highly decorated. But I was talking to that 6-pound Yorkie like he was my kid. Why? Life gets funny sometimes. What ended up happening was everything changed, right? everything. So now when I come home, Fred is coming to the door and he's wagging his tail 1,000 miles an hour to see me. I even take him on rides with me. And that's a story for another day. Me, big macho guy right here. And I got this little teacup Yorkie, but we cool. Story for another day. Freddie didn't hold up a mirror because he was a dog. That interaction held up a mirror. And I look at it like this. Every relationship that we have reflects something back to us. And if it can happen in a dog, it can happen in our relationships. So sometimes we're looking for someone else to change when the relationship is just really revealing something in us. Doesn't mean that every challenge in the relationships is your fault. It's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is before you spend all your energy trying to change someone else, ask yourself this question. What is this relationship trying to teach me about me? Because that's where your growth happens. That's what relational capacity is all about. Now, here's another principle I want you to consider. The greater the relationship, the greater the capacity required. Think about the progression. It takes one level of capacity to have a casual acquaintance, right? It takes another level to maintain a friendship, a good friendship. It takes a deep commitment to maintain a marriage. Forget about adding kids. That is we can't even really measure that, right? But in all seriousness, your capacity is being stretched with each level that you go up. Your leadership requires other levels of capacity. Owning a business, forget about it. When you build an organization, your capacity is expanded because as your responsibilities increase, your expectations increase, and the capacity required has to increase with them. I think this is where many people get frustrated. They assume that because they care deeply about somebody, that the relationship should naturally succeed. But caring and capacity is not the same thing. You can genuinely love someone and struggle to communicate with them. You can deeply value your relationships with your employees and your friends and still fail to deal with them in an effective manner. You can want the very best for your children and still find yourself reacting in ways that you regret later. So your good intentions don't automatically produce healthy relationships. Your capacity does. And that's encouraging because capacity isn't fixed. It can grow. Just as we talked about strengthening your emotional capacity, your cognitive capacity, you can strengthen your relational capacity as well. But before we talk about how to grow it, we first need to understand what's actually made up. Because relational capacity isn't just a skill. It's not one skill. It's made up of several distinct capabilities that work together. And when you lean on one, it's just weakened. So what that means is there's components to relational capacity. And if you don't do them all well, the relationships begin to feel the effect. Make sense? Okay, so let's go a little deeper. So now we know that relationships are the testing grounds of capacity. The next question becomes, what exactly is being tested? So over the years, I've been convinced that healthy relationships aren't built on luck or personality or even chemistry. Healthy relationships are built on capacity. And I believe there are 4 capacities that determine the quality of almost every relationship you ever have. The very first one is trust. Trust answers one simple question. Can people depend on me? Notice I didn't ask whether people like you. Trust and likability are not the same thing. You can be well liked and still not trusted. Trust is built on your words and your actions over time, consistently over time. People know that you'll do what you say when you say. They know you'll be honest even when it's uncomfortable. Trust means that you're dependable when things become difficult. So it's not built on one dramatic moment. Trust is built in hundreds of ordinary moments. Every promise you keep, every commitment you honor, every difficult conversation you choose to have instead of avoiding it, that's trust. It's earned one decision at a time. The second pillar is communication. Communication isn't measured by how much you say. It's measured by how much people understand, the understanding that you create, right? Have you ever walked away from a conversation convinced that, you nailed it out the park? They got you. You got an A+ on understanding. Only to discover that the person heard something completely different. Yeah, we've all been there. Communication isn't complete because the words were spoken. It's complete when understanding is shared. That means listening becomes just as important as speaking. That's hard to do. If I'm gonna be honest with you, it's more important. So one of the greatest gifts you can give another person is your full attention. not waiting until your turn to speak, not preparing your argument, okay? Not just listening long enough to be truly understood. Think about that. The third pillar is connection. Connection answers a different question. Do people feel value when they're with me? This has very little to do with personality. Some of the strongest connections I've experienced have been with people who didn't say much at all. Why? Because they made me feel seen. They remembered my name. They noticed when something wasn't right. They celebrated my victories without making the conversation about themselves. So connection happens when people believe that they matter. Every person you encounter has a desire to be respected, to be heard, to know that they have value. That is high relational capacity. The fourth pillar is contribution. And I think this may be the most important one. Why? Well, contribution asks this question. Do people become better because they're in a relationship with me? Think about that for a moment. When people leave a conversation with you, are they encouraged? Do they have more clarity? Are they more confident? Do they have more hope? Is their direction charted out for them? Or are they exhausted when they leave you? Are they, discouraged? Did you criticize them? Did you beat them over the head? Did they leave uncertain? High capacity relationships don't just simply exist. They produce growth. They make both people better. That's true in marriage, especially true in parenting, leadership, friendships. Healthy relationships aren't measured by how long they've lasted. They're measured by whether people within them continue to grow. Here's what I want you to notice. Trust, communication, connection, contribution. None of those require you to be extraordinarily talented. They don't require you to have a personality. Every one of them, though, has a capacity that can be developed. And that's good news. Because it means if you struggled in relationships, you're not sentenced to stay in that doom. You could become more trustworthy. You can become a better communicator. You can learn how to connect with people more effectively. You can become someone who consistently adds value to the lives of others. That's the power of capacity. But here's the challenge, if I'm being honest about it. If those are the four things that build healthy relationships, there are also habits that quietly erode them. And the difficult part is most people don't recognize what they're doing. So now that we've talked about what builds relational capacity, let's really take a deeper dive into what's quietly destroying it. Most relationships don't fall apart overnight. They erode, a little bit by little bit, conversation by conversation, decision by decision. So trust isn't usually lost in just this big dramatic event. That's not where it started. It's often lost through repeated inconsistencies. It's destroyed it's rarely destroyed in a single disagreement. It's realistically worn away when people stop feeling heard, when the connection disappears. Think about that. When people don't feel heard, they don't think you listen to them anymore, that relationship's going to collapse not because of a catastrophic moment. It just drained away. I want to share with you a few of the most common drains that I've observed over the years. Defensiveness. You ever notice how difficult it is to help someone who immediately becomes defensive? You offer them feedback, all they hear is criticism. You ask them a simple question, you're accusing them all of a sudden. You're trying to help them solve a problem and they begin defending themselves before you've even finished speaking. It closes the door to growth. Okay. When we're constantly protecting our image, we stop improving our capacity. The second drain is the need to be right. We've all met people like this. Every conversation becomes a debate. Every disagreement becomes a competition. Every discussion has to have a winner and a loser. And normally that loser is you. Healthy relationships aren't built on winning arguments. They're built on understanding. Sometimes protecting a relationship is more important than proving your point. The third drain is making assumptions. You've heard what they say. When you assume, you make a out of you and me. Yeah, it's cliche, I know, but there's some truth to that. So one of the quickest ways to damage a relationship is to assume that you know what the other person's thinking. We all fill in the blanks. We all, we assign these motives. We create these stories in our mind. They ignored me. They don't respect me. They didn't, they did that on purpose, really. We often react to the story we created instead of the reality that's actually happening. High relational capacity asks questions before reaching these conclusions. The fourth drain is avoiding difficult conversation. Conflict makes many people uncomfortable, so they avoid it. They stay quiet. They convince themselves it'll work itself out. The problem is, ignored problems rarely disappear. Most of the time, they grow. So your healthy relationships don't avoid difficult conversations. They learn how to have them respectfully, but they have them. The fifth dream is emotional withdrawal. Some people are not going to yell with you. They're not going to argue. They're just going to pull away. They're going to stop engaging. They're going to stop communicating. They become emotionally unavailable. That may reduce conflict temporarily, but it also reduces connection. So healthy relationships require presence, not just your physical presence, your emotional presence. And I want to mention something here. I believe that quietly damages more relationships than we realize. Taking people for granted. The longer you're around someone, the easier it's become to assume that they're going to always be there. We stop expressing appreciation. We stop noticing their contributions. We stop investigating or investing in the relationship because we're comfortable. So here's what I've learned. Relationships require maintenance, just like your health, just like your money, like your business. The second you stop investing, you're going to be withdrawing from an account that doesn't have anything in it, right? Now, here's something I want you to remember. None of these behaviors make somebody a bad person. It just simply reveal areas where relational capacity needs to grow. That's an important distinction. The goal isn't guilt. I'm not trying to guilt you. I just want you aware, because once you recognize what's draining your capacity, you can begin strengthening it. And that's exactly where we're going next. So we've talked about what relational capacity is. We talked about what it builds, what quietly drains it. Now let's make this practical. What does high relational capacity look like at home? What does it look like at work? What does it look like on your next Tuesday? Here's the truth. You don't have one relational capacity for work and another for home. Just have one. Your environment's going to change. Your responsibilities change. The people around you change. But your capacity goes wherever you go. If you struggle to listen to work, you struggle to listen at home. If you become defensive with your spouse, it's a good chance you become defensive when your coworker gives you feedback. If you avoid conversations with your employees, you probably avoid conversations with your children. The setting's going to change. The capacity doesn't. That's why I believe relationships are one of the most honest measures of performance, because eventually everyone experiences who you really are. Not code switching, not the version you present in public, the version that not the version that we put on social media. Everything's perfect. People are going to eventually interact with who you are on a consistent basis. Let's look at that in leadership, right? Many people, they think leadership is about authority. It's not. Leadership is about influence. Influence is built on relationships. If people don't trust you, your influence decreases. If they don't feel like you hear them, your influence decreases. If they don't believe you genuinely care about them and their success, your influence is going to decrease. So leadership is sustained. Well, let me say it this way. Your leadership isn't sustained by your title. It's sustained by your relational capacity. Same thing in your marriage. Man, look, I've been around people long enough to know that love itself is not enough. It's essential. But love got to be supported by capacity. You might love your spouse deeply, right? If you don't communicate, you don't listen, you don't make time, you don't go on date night, okay, you're not investing. And eventually that relationship is going to weaken. Not because the love disappeared, but because the capacity required to sustain the relationship wasn't developed. Parenting works the same way. Kids don't need you to be perfect. They need you to keep growing. Okay. They need you to listen before reacting. Parents who create an environment where questions can be asked without fear, that's relational capacity. Your friendships work the same way. Strong friendships aren't built on people who, just have everything in common. They're built because people continue investing in the relationship. They celebrate their successes. They show up in difficult moments. They tell the truth when it's uncomfortable. They remain trustworthy, right? Now I want to connect this back to performance capacity index. Think about these capacities and how they work together. Your identity capacity is healthy. You're less threatened by disagreements. If your emotional capacity is healthy, you're less likely to overreact in a difficult situation or a difficult conversation. If your cognitive capacity is healthy, you're most likely to seek understanding before making assumptions. And when those three capacities are functioning well, your relational capacity naturally becomes stronger. Do you see where we've been building on these one at a time? They're connected. You can't isolate one without affecting the others. That's why performance is never determined by one capacity alone. It's determined by how all five work together. Now, let me ask you a question. When people think about you, what comes to mind? Do they think I can trust that person? I know that Lawrence is going to tell me the truth. I know he'll show up. He always listens. Okay. He makes me better. Or do they experience something different? That isn't a question of personality. That's a question of capacity. Here's the encouraging part. It can grow. You can become more trustworthy, right? You can become a better listener. You can learn to have navigate better through difficult conversations. You can strengthen your relationships one decision at a time. That's what capacity development is all about. But before we close today's conversation, there's one more distinction I think is incredibly important. Not every relationship challenge is simply a capacity issue. Sometimes something deeper is happening. And I want to spend a few minutes to talk about those. Okay. Look, throughout this podcast, we've been talking about performance. We've been talking about developing the capacities that help us perform at home, at life, in our day-to-day lives. I also want to recognize that sometimes a relationship problem is bigger than the capacity problem. Sometimes people ask me, hey, Dr. Lawrence, if I improve my relational capacity, will every relationship get better? No. You got to keeping it 100 with you. No. And that's important to understand. You can become a better communicator. Okay. You're going to still have people that choose not to listen to you. You can become more patient and someone else is still going to get angry with you. You can become more trustworthy and another person may still struggle to trust you because of their experiences. They had nothing to do with you. Healthy relationships require participation from both people. You are responsible for your capacity. You are responsible. Look, you can't control someone else. It's an important distinction. So let's look at it a different way. Suppose you worked on your communication, you've learned to listen, you've been less defensive, you learn how to navigate conflict. Okay. But every disagreement still come out the same way. Every conversation becomes explosive. Every attempt to connect is met with manipulation and intimidation. At some point, we have to ask a different question. Is this simply a capacity issue or something deeper going on? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes there are unresolved wounds that person's carrying. They may be dealing with long-standing patterns of abuse, trauma, addiction. Something else may be going on. Okay. Those situations often require more than a podcast. They may require counseling or therapy. Okay. They may require pastoral guidance. They may require medicine or psychiatric care. And look, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay. Getting help in that situation demonstrates wisdom. So one of the greatest mistakes I think we make is assuming that every problem has the same solution, and it doesn't. Just as we wouldn't expect someone with a broken leg to solve the problem by simply trying harder. How crazy would that be? We shouldn't expect every complex relational issue to be resolved through better communication alone. Sometimes additional help is appropriate. Sometimes it's necessary. And I want to speak to another group of people. Some of you have spent years trying to improve relationships with people who simply refuse to participate. You've carried the burden. You've initiated every difficult conversation. You've apologized. You've extended grace. You tried to rebuild trust. Eventually, okay, what are you supposed to do? That's the question you find yourself asking yourself. So here's my encouragement. Continue developing your capacity, because regardless of what someone else chooses, growing your capacity will never be wasted. It'll make you a better person, a better parent, a better friend, a better leader, better follower of Christ. But don't confuse personal growth with personal responsibility for somebody else's decisions. Not the same thing. So throughout the series, I've intentionally focused on the things that you can control. You can strengthen your identity. You can strengthen your emotional capacity. You can strengthen your cognitive capacity. You can also strengthen your relational capacity. Okay, that's where your responsibility begins. And that's also where it ends. So as we close today's episode, I want to remind you of something. Healthy relationships aren't built because perfect people find each other. They're built because imperfect people continue developing the capacity required to love, to forgive, to grow, to serve one another over time. That's the heart of relational capacity. People don't experience your intentions. They experience your capacity. So this week, as you look at difficult relationships, ask yourself this question. What is this relationship trying to teach me? Look, if today's conversation challenged you, don't let it stop there. This episode may be the only piece of a much larger framework. In my book, The Performance Capacity Index, I'll walk through all 5 capacities in a much greater detail and show you how they work together to influence every area of your life. So whether you're leading a business, building a marriage, raising kids, or simply trying to become the best person God created you to be, this framework will help you understand why performance isn't just about talent, it's about capacity. This book is available right now on Amazon in both paperback and Kindle. Hope you pick up a copy. And if you're ready to go beyond the book, I'd love to personally invite you to join the Performance Matters community. That's where we'll continue these conversations. We'll dive deeper into the 5 capacities. We'll provide assessments, implementations. We'll do some live coaching, one-on-one, exclusive content, all of that. We're committed to becoming, better performers. Everything you need can be found in the links below. So if today's episode added value to your life, would you do me one more favor? Subscribe to the channel. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, everybody's performing. Not everybody's performing well. The good news is your capacity can be developed. And in our next episode, we're going to explore the final piece of the Performance Capacity Index, because even if your identity is healthy, even if your emotions are managed, even if your thinking is clear, and your relationships are now strong, you still need something else to sustain high performance over a long term. And we're going to talk about structural capacity. And I believe it may be one of the capacities that determines whether all the others are sustainable or not. So until next time, thank you for watching Empowerment with Dr. Lawrence. I'll see you soon.